So what we're going to do now is to create some error handling middleware that we can add to our middleware inside our startup.cs class. Now, anything we put inside the configure method here, ordering is important. And let's just take a quick look at the documentation for ASP.NET Core middleware. And this little diagram here gives us the idea of what's going on here. We receive our request, it hits some middleware, there's some logic inside there, and then we hit the next method, and that passes it on to the next piece of middleware. And each piece of middleware is a request delegate that's called one after the other. And exception handling delegates should be called early in the pipeline so that they can catch exceptions that occur in later stages of the pipeline. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go back to VS Code, and inside our API project this time, and let's just organize things a little bit neater. Inside the API project, I'm just going to create a new folder and just call it middleware. And what we want to add in here is a new C# class, and we'll call it error handling middleware, and press return. Now we need a constructor in here, so let's create a new constructor, and this is going to take two parameters. First of all, we need to give it the request delegates that we were just referring to, and we'll call this next, and we'll also need to bring in ASP.NET Core HTTP, and as well as this, what we'll also bring in is the iLogger, so that we can log what's going on inside this particular middleware into our terminal window. So our iLogger needs to know the class it's logging against, so we'll pass in the error handling middleware and just call this logger. And we'll also need to bring in Microsoft extensions logging. And because we're injecting these inside here, what we'll also need to do is create the private fields. So we'll initialize a field from parameter for the request delegates, and we'll also do the same for the logger. And for some reason it's decided not to add the underscore here, so I'll just add this and remove this dot as well. So inside our middleware we need one method, and we need the public async task, and we need to call this invoke. And we need to pass this the HTTP context, and we'll just call this context. And we'll also need to bring in system.threading.tasks. So inside here we're going to have a try-catch block. Our goal here is to catch our exceptions and then do something with it. So in the try, all we want to do, if there's no exception, we'll just say await, and we'll say next, and pass the context. And this will move the request onto the next piece of middleware. And if there's an exception, we want to catch this, and we'll say catch exception ex. And we'll also need to bring in system. And what we'll do in here, we'll say await and handle exception async. And this will be a method that we create inside this particular class. And what we'll do is we'll pass it the context, we'll pass it our exception, and we'll also pass it the logger as well. And then we'll put our cursor inside this and use the quick fix to generate the method error handling middleware handle exception async. And then we can come down to this particular method and we can implement our logic inside here. Now I'm just going to create an object called errors, and I'm going to set this equal to null. And then what we want to do is take a look at our exception and see what type of exception it is, and if it's our REST exception, then we want to add our status code and our errors to the response, and if it's a normal exception, then we want to make sure this is sent back as a 500 internal server error. So what we'll do is we'll use a switch, and we'll base it on the exception we're passing in. And then in the case of it's a REST exception, and we'll call this RE, and we'll also need to bring in our application errors, and then we'll use the logger and say logger.log error, and we'll pass in the exception, and then we'll just put REST error in capitals so it's easily identifiable. And then we'll use our errors object and say errors equals re.errors. And then we'll use our context, and we can add something to our response here. So we can use the context.response and the status code, and we can set this to an integer, or we'll cast it to an integer, and we'll say re.code. And then we'll break from this particular case. So this deals with our REST exception, and we also need to deal with the normal exceptions because we're catching all of our exceptions now in this exception handling middleware. So in the case of a normal exception, we'll just say case exception and E, and then we'll say logger.log error. And in here we'll pass in the exception, and this time we'll say server error, and we'll say the errors object in this case equals string, and we'll check to see if this is null or white space for the error.message, and if it is null or white space we'll just say error, and if it's not null or white space we'll pass back the message, and we'll add the break. So below our switch statement we'll say context.response.content type, and we'll set this equal to application/JSON, and we'll say if the errors is not equal to null, then we'll say var results equals JSON convert, and we'll need to bring in newtonsoft.json, and then we'll serialize our objects, and what we'll do is we'll say new, and then we'll just pass in the errors. And following this we'll just say await context.response.write async, and we'll pass in the results. And I'm getting an error here because we also need to make this an async task, and that should resolve that particular problem. So this is our middleware, and just to review, what we're doing here is we're invoking some middleware. We're going to receive our request via the context, and if there's no exception we're simply going to pass through this middleware and pass it on to the next delegate. But if this contains an exception, then we're going to catch this in here, and then we're going to handle our exception, and we're going to check to see if it's a REST exception or a normal exception, and then write in the response to our HTTP response. So, for example, if we send back a status code of 404, then this is what's going to be sent back in our HTTP response, rather than an exception. And what we also need actually inside our exception that I've missed off at this stage is we also need to provide the status code that we're returning in the case of an exception. And what we also need in here is context.response.status code, and we need to set this equal to a 500 type error. So this is going to be, we'll cast this to an int, and we'll get the HTTP status code, and we'll need to bring in system.net, and we'll specify internal server error. So this handles both our exceptions, and what we'll take a look at next is how we can actually use this middleware.